Hello everybody. Today I would like to talk about a test cutting target. Let me introduce myself first. I have been doing test cutting since year 2000. Back then, I might very well be the first person to test cut pork arm and post video on the net. I was earlier than Cold Steel and some Longchuan maker that test cut pork arm. They very likely followed my trade, and so I have been test cutting for more than 23 years to this date. And pork arm as a target was pretty accurate, but we'll come to this point later on. Why I stopped cutting pork arm. Back then, the whole sword market wasn't up to the current standard yet, and so when I request a blade with an edge that could cut flesh and bone very well, I was even accused by a famous swordsmith back then that I would use that sword for some illegal activities like murdering in the mall. But he took down that post after being warned by the moderator that such accusation could lead to lawsuits. But after 23 years of staying in the sword circle, I think I proved myself not a murderous spree going person. So you can realize that back then, in year 2000, not many makers were prepared to make a sword good for cutting realistic targets. They even think the buyer demanding or requesting a sword with good performance on realistic target as someone suspicious. So that's the background story. And I went for realistic targets since then, when everybody was only cutting wooden board, plywood, and water bottles. I already cut pork arm. So let's talk about the popular test cut targets nowadays in the sword circle. And I will try to introduce from the easier stuff toward the more difficult stuff. And in terms of difficulties, there are two kinds of difficulties, which can be classified as the unrealistic difficult one and the realistic difficult one. And they are different, okay? I will explain later how different they are. The first thing that is common in the sword test cutting circle is a milk jug. A milk jug is a plastic bottle somewhere this big. It's not common in Hong Kong, but very common in USA and in Europe as well. The milk jug is very thin plastic, and people can cut this milk jug piece by piece without the bottom flying off, and make a ring out of the bottle. And this is a pretty easy target. It doesn't require very good blade alignment. It doesn't require a very sharp edge to cut, and the plastic is actually very thin. And another similar target is cheap, like the pickle tube. Yeah, chip tube. The chip tube, the paperboard tube, can be also cut into rings, and those are very easy targets to cut. And another easy target to cut that would not dull your blade, because the paper tube, the cardboard tube, will dull your blade, so pay attention to that. There are abrasives inside the cardboard materials that sometimes there is aluminum pieces inside, or there are some sand inside that can turn your edge dull pretty quickly. Another target that I would like to mention that will not dull your blade very fast is the foam noodle. A foam noodle is those that's used for swimming, float you on the water. Those are very lightweight target. and they can bend easily. So their difficulty lies in that you have to have a sharp edge and good alignment, and then they can be cut very easily without much resistance. Otherwise it will bend upon the impact, and your sword will not cut through it. It just hit and it flies away, or hit and it bend. So the foam noodle is one of the easy and common targets that we come across. And then the next level of difficulties is the water bottles. The water bottles we are talking about are not made of glass. We are talking about plastic water bottles. Plastic water bottles can be cut with water or without water. In mainland China, they are very keen on cutting those empty bottles. They think that cutting empty bottles is a display of skill, which is not a very difficult display. If you ask me, I can cut empty bottles sitting on a chair with a single hand, but it does require a certain amount of skill in terms of blade alignment, speed, and the edge sharpness. But why would I say that empty bottle is not a very good measure of skill? Is that it's too light. They think if you can cut something very light that will fly away upon impact, that means you are good. Okay, but you have to understand that swords in the past, in history, were not means to cut something like that. Many swords designed in the past were means to face opponents weighing over 100 pounds, and they are sword design better suited for cutting light and fast-moving targets, while the others were good at cutting heavy and more resisting targets. If you only measure your display of skill by cutting very lightweight target like an empty water bottle, plastic bottle, you will have skewed your view in the understanding of swords performance. You will skew toward those swords that do well on the lightweight target, and you will think those swords that are good on resisting substantial target as something not performing good. So that's one of the reasons why I advocate against cutting empty bottles. But of course, my voice alone is not enough to turn the tide. And you all understand that in mainland China, they just flock to the most vocal opinion. So that's my stand on cutting empty bottle. And cutting water bottles with filled water bottle is easier in terms of the speed requirement, because it has some certain weight to stay in place for you to cut it, and it doesn't fly away that easily like an empty bottle, which is true, but will come up. As I mentioned, that difficulty is not realistic one. And cutting water bottles have different kind of difficulties because the water bottles can come in a various shape and material. They have different sizes, different thickness, and different stiffness and hardness. So not all water bottles are within the same difficulties. Some of my students who are weaker in nature, like a female student, she may cut the easier bottles alright, but may have difficulty in terms of cutting the more resisting, stiffer water bottles. So not all water bottles are the same, and they are in itself a grade more difficult to cut than milk jug. They are not the same animal. Okay, milk jug is very easy, and like those chips tube, very easy. and the milk carton, very easy. The water bottles are slightly more difficult. And then we'll come to another common test target, which is mats. The beach mats and then tatami mats, something like that. And not all mats are equal. Again, there are different kind of mats available. The easiest one to cut in terms of mats are the beach mats. The beach mats are very easy to cut. How easy, you may ask? They are actually easier than some of the tougher bottles. And they are good for building up your confidence because they have a very high tolerance of error. And then you will come to the one step further up above the beach mat. It's the Chinese made mat. Chinese made mat, they come with single layer or double layer, and the single layer one is easier and the double layer one is more difficult. And then there is Japanese mat. The Japanese mat classified into the new mats and the old mats. The new mats are easier to cut because they soak in water faster and they become water filled easier. And for the old mats, the Japanese old mats, which we often see being cut in the Japanese tameshigiri competition, those are the old mats. They are more difficult to cut than the new mats, and they require a longer soak time for the water to soak into it. Sometimes take 3 days. And even among the old mats, there are different kinds of difficulties. Some were more difficult to cut, like those woven with nylon thread, the fishing line thread. Those are notorious for being difficult to cut, and the others, they usually use the easier ones for the tournaments, so that they can have a better performance, better display, more spectacular display of skill in the public. Okay, so they use the more difficult to cut one for their own practice to build up the skill level, and then use the easier to cut one in competition. That's what I've heard from them. So there are different kind of mats. When you actually start to cut mats, you will dig deeper into the knowledge of which mat equal to which level. So there were used to be a brand called Mugen Dachi, which doesn't compare to Japanese used mat, but more like a Chinese made mat, somewhere among the middle grade in terms of difficulties. So that's a mat. And then we come to the bamboo. Bamboo are pretty difficult targets, but it came with different kind of size and wall thickness. The smaller diameter will be easier to cut. The thinner the wall thickness will also be easier to cut. When cutting bamboo, you will not actually feel about going through a certain kind of distance inside the target, but a very light impact, pop, and then it cut off. I've cut plenty different kind of bamboos myself, and usually the larger diameter but thinner wall bamboo are very easy to cut. It will be easier than a smaller diameter, thicker wall bamboo. So the wall thickness come before the actual diameter. And there are attributes about tatami and bamboo targets that made them not very realistic. The problem with bamboo and tatami is that they were both plant growing up from they have a vertical grain. What I mean is they have a vertical grain. If you have cut wood or bamboo or tatami, you will notice that vertical cuts on them are extremely easy, while when you cut against the grain, like a horizontal cut will be extremely difficult. But is it realistic on ourselves being a target? Nope. Human bone has the strongest resistance in terms of vertical and has the weakest resistance to impact when you go horizontal against the bone. So with the issues, the attributes of the tatami and bamboo targets are exactly the opposite of a humanoid target. So it will produce a not as realistic result if you use a good technique on human on the tatami or bamboo. Another reason on tatami and bamboo is that not being very ideal targets is that they are extremely sensitive on sharpness. When you cut the most difficult kind of tatami mat, like the used Japanese style tatami mat or on bamboo, you need very, very sharp edge. There are people on USA or in Europe cutting mats and find that they don't need a sharp sword to cut that. That's only because you are not cutting the most difficult kind of tatami mat. You are cutting the middle kind of tatami mat, and they are pretty forgiving. But if you go with those tatami mats that Japanese dojo cut, then you will come against those targets that you only be able to cut with very sharp edge. So sharp that it will rule out plenty historical correct sword design. So that's one thing that will skew your view on what is a good performing sword, which I don't like about. And then we will come across another kind of target, which is composite target. Composite target is adding two kind of targets together. Then we often see that tatami targets wrapped around a soft wood core or wrapped around a bamboo to simulate the bone. These have the same issues that I mentioned, that they are not behaving like a humanoid target. They have easier cut on vertical side but harder cut on horizontal, which is directly opposite of what it should be. And then we come to, let's talk about pork arm first. Why did I stop cutting pork arm? While it is relatively easy to obtain and it seems to be the most accurate target, why do I stop cutting pork arm? Since I started it I'm the first guy started it. Pork arm actually posed another problem. The first one is being too difficult. It's overly difficult compared to the actual target, like a person. Why? Because the pork arm we get from the shop has been dead for many hours. Once the blood flow ceases to flow in the vein, in the bone starts to calcify. When it calcifies, it becomes hard and hard and hard. This is one problem. The second problem is the muscle and the flesh on the bone are in dead state. The dead state is totally relaxed. So when you cut pork arm, the impact resistance that you get from hitting the target is a very solid impact, as if you were hitting a brick, a stone, something like that. You don't feel hitting the flesh at all. The flesh is no feeling, no resistance. The skin, the fat, the muscle, no resistance. It just opens easily, as if it's just air. Or the resistance came from the bone, which were already hardening. So it is not very realistic compared to a living target, but we don't cut living target, right? That's the first reason. The second reason is the growths that left over on the blade are hard to clean and stinky. The third reason I stopped cutting that is the mess that left on the floor are hard to clean. The fourth reason is that I don't actually eat the target I cut, so I have to return it to the shop for some little refunding. And that is not an enjoyable process overall. So I stopped cutting pork arm maybe since, I don't remember the last time I cut it. It was several years ago at least. And I have been looking for a realistic synthetic substitute. And I came across a post by Peter Johnson that mentioned about a kind of target made of PPR pipe, a kind of plastic pipe that does not tend to shatter like PVC, but tend to be cut and wrapped with soaked newspaper. I switched to this kind of target, and this kind of target is extremely realistic to speak of. Better than ballistic gel. We'll talk about that.
But it's a fairly sharp blade. Let's say I hit myself with it. I'm sitting here nicking myself with it, but it's not nicking me. I'm not draw cutting. I'm just hitting, and I'm over a vein, so that's good. I'm not getting cut like I got cut the other day or something. But now let's say I do this to ballistics gelatin. What happens if I hack at ballistic gelatin? We're not talking about draw cutting, we're just hacking. I just put a nice cut in this, and this is 10% ballistic gelatin, regular gelatin. But look at that, that was from a hack. You cannot do that with a human arm. I can hit just as hard and it's not going to, unless I screw up and draw, it's not going to go in. So to me, that shows that it's not accurate on cutting. It cuts much easier. And if you cut ballistics gelatin, always draw in one direction, but it should cut. See the drag? Are you guys watching the drag on this? The drag is ridiculous. The drag on the blade. The only thing that would slow you down is not cutting it, but blade drag. To show you a difference, something that people consider a good cutting medium, which is a lot like tatami, is wet newspaper. If I take it and I hack at it, I get a cut, but I mean, it doesn't cut that easily as the other. You get a little bit of a cut. You don't get the same kind of cut. But the idea is you have to draw cut this stuff to get a good cut. It's not a bad medium, really. See there, it didn't even cut, if you look what I'm trying to say. Hack a little harder, yeah, you get a cut.
This target has when you make it well, what is made it well, it actually varies a lot if on how tight you wrap the newspaper around the core. The tighter you wrap, the more difficult it becomes because the less water could get soaked inside. So I have my own standard on how tight I wrap the target. I wrap the target at the tightness of a relaxed muscle. I check myself on the fight to get a feeling first, and then as a reference, and then wrap my target with the same flexibility of relaxed muscle. And then I soak them. It has a less, you only have to soak 30 minutes, which is a lot shorter duration compared to tatami mats. So it is easier to be ready to cut. And then after soaking, the water will grow in size and they swell up and fill up all the space you originally left inside. It will become tight and stiffened. How stiff it feels? It will feel like a stiff muscle. When you tense your muscle and try to poke it and then poke the newspaper roll, it's the same kind of tenseness. And we measure the bone that's of the target we cut to replicate the parts we want to cut on. So we have different kind of diameter of the core with different kind of wall thickness as well to simulate the target we cut. And with this kind of target, you also have another bonus, is that it actually weighs very closely to the actual limb you are simulating. For example, when I've cut an upper arm target, my upper arm weighed 5 pounds on the scale, and that target simulator weighed 4 pounds, a little bit more than 4 pounds. So that means I took away my fat and skin and just the muscle and bone. It actually weighs around the same. This is a very important factor in realism. We mentioned about difficulties in unrealistic difficulty and realistic difficulties, right? Most of the difficulties from the unrealistic side came from being too light in weight so that it flies away before you can cut it. So it favors a fast moving sword over a heavier, powerful sword, okay? And this will, as I mentioned before, this will give you a skewed understanding. But with this kind of target, with actual about the same weight being present there, with the enough resistance it gives you back, you can test swords that were historically practical on this kind of targets. These kind of targets are more forgiving for sharpness, but it still requires pretty sharp sword, not those factory edge, okay? It still requires lance not sharp to cut, but not to the extreme sharpness that cuts the Japanese used tatami. And then also your edge will have to be able to withstand cutting living bone hardness target. Living bone hardness is different from dead bone hardness, okay? So the PPR pipe inside, according to Peter Johnson, which I agree wholeheartedly, replicates a living bone hardness very well. So the edge from lance not sharp standard is that it can cut through fabric surface but survive through cutting through the living bone hardness. This is what makes this kind of target very realistic. This is the weight is similar to the actual body part. And the other thing is that it doesn't have the attribute of tatami or bamboo or wood that vertical cut become very easy and the horizontal cut become extremely difficult. With this kind of target, all directional becomes a realistic simulation, as if you are cutting actual body parts. They don't have a preference on which direction is easier to succeed. That's the second thing. And the third thing is that you can actually put on fabric cover on it to simulate the target wearing clothes or protective layers of armor, fabric armors. You can test your skill against a realistic target because you are not likely to fight a native operant, right? Most of the time they are going to wear clothes or even protective clothes, so you have to gauge how good you perform on such target by putting a realistic simulator and then put on the same fabric cover for a measure. This is why I stopped cutting pork arm and switched to this kind of target. It is much easier to clean, much easier to prepare, and less trouble to recycle or trash around. Okay, there are some kind of targets that I don't cut often, but people cut a lot. There is wooden branch. I would not cut wooden branch or a tree because I don't like to destroy or hurt a tree at all. We as humankind has already hurt the nature more enough. I would like people to actually protect the environment. So do not cut trees. Swords were not means to cut trees, and cutting trees will hurt your sword. Is considered an abuse. Okay, so I do not cut tree. But people in mainland China, they cut rocks, cut tree. They have no sense. Of course, trees are difficult targets because, and this is among the unrealistic difficulty. too hard as being a simulator of human target. And then there are people who cut a piece of paper, or sometimes with a piece of paper hanging like this, and they cut the paper, or they roll the paper into a cylindrical shape for cutting. Don't confuse this as cutting the newspaper roll target that I mentioned, because it's just one piece of paper. They are difficult, of course, but difficult in terms of unrealistic sense, because your actual target for a sword fight in the past would not be a piece of paper. They will not be that thin first, and that's unsubstantial in terms of weight. So these are some kind of cutting target that I have seen. I've also cut before, but I would advocate against cutting them as any kind of a measure of skill. And that's a very, I think I come across almost all kind of popular test cutting targets. And hope you enjoy this video. I will try to find some pictures of these targets and put into the video so you don't have to watch me talking all the time. Okay, see ya.